Hey, you cool cats and kittens, it's Miss Yabut here. Wow, welcome to another week of Vista Virtual Learning on Google Classroom. I am so excited to start our historical fiction novel today, but first, a couple of announcements. Remember, if you haven't already logged on this morning, make sure that you go on Lexia for 30 minutes. You need 150 minutes by Friday, so it's so important that if you do Lexia for 30 minutes every day, then you will already have finished your minutes by Friday. Scholars, don't forget that we also have ELA Reteach today at 1:30 if you're invited, and office hours from 2:45 to 4 o'clock. You get 3 Vista Virtual points, and I can't wait to hear who won our Vista Virtual points this week. ELA Masters, today we get to read one of Miss Yabut's favorite historical fiction novels. It's called Sadako and the Thousand Paper Cranes by Eleanor Coer. Again, this is a historical fiction text, which means that the setting is real. And this text is actually very special because the main character, Sadako, is also a real girl. So she was someone who was real and lived during this time. However, because it is a historical fiction text, we still know that parts of this story come from the author's imagination. For example, a lot of the feelings that Sadako has, maybe some of her friends, and some things that she's experiencing might be from the author's imagination. Other parts of this, though, are based on the real-life Sadako Sasaki. I can't wait to read more about her today. Dear readers, as we're reading Sadako and the Thousand Paper Cranes, which we'll be reading for the next couple weeks, good readers always need to make sure that we're asking ourselves these questions while reading any historical fiction text. First, I want to ask myself, how is the setting important to the plot of the story? We know by now that in a historical fiction text, the setting, the time, and place is very important. Next, I also want to ask myself, what can stories teach readers about the past? Last week, we read about the atomic bomb. And as we read about Sadako and the Thousand Paper Cranes, through this character's perspective, we're thinking to ourselves, what is she teaching me about the past? Finally, we also want to make sure, especially as we begin our text today, how do readers distinguish fact from fiction when reading historical fiction? Scholars, let's review what historical fiction is first. Remember, I can go into classwork and under resources, click where it says historical fiction. You are going to have about 45 seconds to answer the first 2 questions using our resource. What kind of text is historical fiction? And which of the following are characteristics of historical fiction? The first 2 questions. Get ready and go. Five more seconds, scholars. Let's see how we did. ELA Masters, remember that historical fiction is an imaginative story that takes place in the historical past and may have some real events or people. One more time, my turn. Historical fiction is an imaginative story that takes place in the historical past and may have some real events or people. Now, your turn. Historical fiction is an. You've got it. Scholars, as I mentioned, historical fiction, like Sadako and the Thousand Paper Cranes, is an imaginative story. It is fiction, and even though some parts of it are based on real facts, like Sadako's Sasaki, who's a real girl, and where she lives, even though those are real, most of the story still comes from the author's imagination and is make believe. As a result, we know that historical fiction is narrative. It is fiction. If you got that for number one, give me a high five. Great job, friends. Our first characteristic of historical fiction is that the setting is important. Last week, I told you that this setting is based in Japan and specifically Hiroshima in the 1950s. Can you remind me from last week what is so important about the setting in Hiroshima in the 1950s? Tell me. Right, scholars. Last week, we read about the atomic bomb, which was a devastating bomb that was dropped on the Japanese towns of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. So, the setting, this time and place is important because if I know that Sadako and the Thousand Paper Cranes takes place in Hiroshima in the 1950s, so several years after the atomic bombs were dropped on Japan, then I know that that must be important to the plot of my story. ELA Masters, if you selected this first one, the setting is important, show me a yes. Good. My second characteristic of historical fiction is that it is often focused on real issues of the time and the characters' perspective of them, how they think or feel, how they. Good. So, again, last week we talked about the atomic bomb and how that sadly happened as a result of the end of World War II when Japan would not surrender and the terrible decision that President Truman decided to make. These were real issues at the time. And we're also thinking about the characters' perspective of them. We know that Sadako is a real girl, but some details like her thoughts, feelings, and actions still come from the author's imagination. They are still make believe. But thinking about Sadako's thoughts, feelings, and actions in dialogue helps us understand her perspective of these real issues at the time, like the atomic bomb in Japan. ELA Masters, if you selected this second answer choice, show me a yes. Yes. It is often focused on a real issue in history, and in this case, Sadako's perspective of that time. Finally, scholars, some values, perspectives, and living conditions are different from today. We talked about this last week, but now it would not be possible for the United States to make a decision like dropping a bomb as catastrophic as this on a country with which we're at war. Scholars, we now know that because of how many people died because of the atomic bombs, we no longer think it is okay to use these types of weapons, even though they exist today. So yes, some values, perspectives, and living conditions are different from today. Of course, as we discussed earlier last week, we also know that Japanese people are actually very peaceful now in 2020, and we'll learn more about that in our text today. In your Google form, if you selected this last answer choice, give me a pound it. Right. Scholars, again, is historical fiction a nonfiction text with real facts? Agree or disagree? No. So we do not select this third answer choice. Scholars, see if you can tell me, one or two, what genre of text are we reading today? Is Sadako and the Thousand Paper Cranes historical fiction or infotext? Tell me. Yes, if you showed me historical fiction, go ahead and pat yourself on the back. Right. Like I said, Sadako and the Thousand Paper Cranes is based on a real setting in Hiroshima in the 1950s in Japan and a real girl, Sadako Sasaki. But a lot of the details, like Sadako's thoughts, feelings, and actions, come from the author's imagination. They are not real. Scholars, we know that as good readers, we often read a nonfiction text before we read the fiction text because it builds our schema about the setting and important people and events of the time. Last week, we read The Atomic Bomb. Can you tell me in 1 to 2 complete sentences, what was the atomic bomb? Right. The atomic bomb took place during a real time and place in history. We also noted last week some important people and events and came up with one main idea. The US forced Japan to surrender in World War II by destroying Hiroshima and Nagasaki with terribly powerful atomic bombs, killing hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians and causing more to become sick. We know civilians often included women, children, and men who didn't do anything wrong and weren't involved in the war. Again, friends, this came from our nonfiction informational text that we read last week, The Atomic Bomb. Let's review some of the questions that we had in our exit ticket. Number 1, Part A. What is the genre of the atomic bomb? ELA Masters, some of us got a little bit tricked. Many of us selected A, real facts. And yes, the atomic bomb did have some real facts, but we call the genre of this text, the type of text that this is, a nonfiction text. This is a nonfiction informational text. So the correct answer here was letter B. Again, why did we read this nonfiction historical text? Tell me. Yes, it helped build our schema, right, about that time in the historical past. Scholars, last week I asked you that the fiction text we're going to read for the next 2 weeks, Sadako and the Thousand Paper Cranes, is about a Japanese girl named Sadako who lives in Hiroshima in the 1950s. Based on what you now know about this time period, what do you predict might happen in the story? One scholar wrote, I predict that this is living in Japan while they dropped the bomb, because the US dropped one bomb in Hiroshima and a couple days after in Nagasaki, causing many people to die. Friends, that is true, but did that happen in the 1950s? Right. Scholars, this event that this scholar is saying occurred in 1945. Sadako and the Thousand Paper Cranes takes place in the 1950s. So that is several years after the bombs were dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So as good readers, we need to be thinking to ourselves, what must have been like in these cities after the bombs were dropped? Again, during this time, the bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki were already dropped, and people living in those cities were dealing with the effects of the bomb. This scholar predicted that the Japanese girl Sadako will talk about what happened years after the atomic bomb attacks. A lot of people got sick afterwards. I really love how this scholar is thinking about that specific piece of evidence we talked about last week, where thousands of people in Japan died or got sick from the bomb. Finally, this scholar predicted that Sadako will get sick from the atomic bomb but survives. I know because the atomic bomb was dropped after a story, but radiation is still happening. I love how this scholar remembered that important term, radiation, and that it's the radiation that is causing people to get sick, as we talked about last week, months or even years after the bombs were dropped. We now know that Sadako and the Thousand Paper Cranes takes place several years after the bombs were dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So we need to be thinking to ourselves, what were the effects of those bombs now, even many years after? Is there radiation still happening? ELA Masters, because we are reading a historical fiction text today, it's so important that we continue to ask ourselves, what is fact or real, and what is fiction? Comes from the author's imagination. Can you remind me? To differentiate between what is fact and what is fiction in a historical fiction text, as good readers, we ask ourselves, is the time, place, important people, or important events real things from history? What are these called? Yes, these are facts. These really happened. And I need to ask myself, if anything is real in this story, then that is a fact. It is true. If you need to, pause your video and type that in now. Good. The next question. Then, as good readers, we ask ourselves, which parts of the story are coming from the author's imagination, like Sadako's thoughts or feelings? What are these called? Yes, these would be considered fiction. Again, it is make-believe. And many parts of the story, like Sadako's perspectives or some of her actions and thoughts and feelings, that is going to be fiction, scholars. If you need to, pause your video to type that in now. And when you're finished, go ahead and click next.